It was supposed to be just another quiet evening at one of the city's most popular restaurants. Families were seated, enjoying their meals, and laughter filled the air. But no one expected what would happen next, a moment that would change everything. At a table near the corner, a wealthy white man sat with an air of arrogance. He was impeccably dressed, the kind of man who seemed used to getting what he wanted without question. His watch gleamed under the dim restaurant lights, and every movement he made was precise, controlled, almost like he believed the world revolved around him. Across from him, at a neighboring table, sat a black family. It was clear they were enjoying a special occasion. The parents exchanged smiles, while their two children, wide-eyed and excited, looked at the menu as though picking the perfect dish was the most important decision of the day. They had done nothing unusual, nothing to stand out, just an ordinary family, enjoying a peaceful meal together. But something about this black family seemed to rub the millionaire the wrong way. Maybe it was their happiness. Maybe it was the fact that they were seated near him, that they existed in the same space he felt he dominated. Whatever the reason, his face twisted into a look of disgust. Loud enough for those nearby to hear, he muttered something under his breath. At first, the words were low, almost indistinguishable, but soon his frustration boiled over. "People like them don't belong in places like this," he sneered, casting a disdainful glance at the family. The mother noticed, her smile faltering. She exchanged a quick glance with her husband, who gently squeezed her hand in reassurance. They were used to this kind of treatment, but that didn't make it any less painful. The children, too young to understand the full weight of the situation, continued to chatter, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing nearby. The millionaire, emboldened by the lack of response, leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he had won some unspoken battle. His eyes flicked over to the waiter, who was approaching his table to refill his glass. The waiter was a young man, polite and efficient, who had been working at the restaurant for a few years. He knew the type of customer the millionaire was demanding, entitled and often rude to the staff. As the waiter poured the water, the millionaire's voice, now louder, cut through the peaceful ambience. "I don't know why this place lets just anyone in," he said, making sure his words were heard by the family and anyone else nearby. His tone was dripping with condescension, as if he truly believed he was doing the world a favor by speaking his mind. The waiter paused for a split second, his hands steady, but his expression unreadable. He didn't react outwardly, but inside, something shifted. He glanced at the black family, who were now visibly uncomfortable, the joy of their evening slowly being drained away by the man's hurtful words. The restaurant's atmosphere grew tense. Other diners began to notice, casting furtive glances toward the source of the tension. But no one said anything. No one ever did in moments like this. It was easier to look away, to pretend nothing was happening. But not for the waiter. Finishing up with the millionaire's table, the waiter disappeared into the kitchen for a moment. When he returned, he placed a small piece of paper beside the millionaire's glass, with a polite, "Here's your check, sir." The millionaire, without looking up, waved him off, assuming it was just the bill. He was ready to leave, convinced that his remarks had gone unchecked, that he had proven his superiority once again. But something about the waiter's calm demeanor felt off. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, as if he knew something the millionaire didn't. The millionaire, curious now, picked up the note and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words, and in an instant, his smug expression melted away, replaced by something far different: shock. His face turned red, and for the first time that evening, he was speechless. What could the note possibly say to shake a man so confident, so certain of his place above others? The tension in the air was palpable, and the black family watched from their table, unsure of what had just transpired, but sensing that something significant had just happened. The waiter, standing a few feet away, met the millionaire's gaze briefly, his face still composed, but his eyes telling a different story. It was clear that this wasn't over. Whatever was written on that note was more than just words. It was a message, a statement that would leave the millionaire questioning everything. But what did it say? And what would happen next? The restaurant buzzed with the usual clatter of dishes and the hum of low conversations, but at the millionaire's table, silence hung in the air. He stared at the note, his fingers gripping the edges so tightly that the paper crinkled. His face, flushed moments ago with anger and superiority, now showed a mixture of disbelief and confusion. His eyes darted to the waiter, who was calmly attending to another table as if nothing had happened. The air of confidence around the young man was unmistakable, and it was clear that whatever was written on that note had turned the evening on its head. The Black family, though still seated at their table, could feel the shift. The mother leaned slightly forward, her curiosity piqued, while her husband gave a subtle glance towards the millionaire's table, trying to understand what had just unfolded. The children continued eating, blissfully unaware, but the tension in the room was becoming impossible to ignore. The millionaire cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but the words on the note echoed in his mind. He looked around, almost expecting someone to be watching him, mocking him, but no one seemed to be paying any special attention. At least not yet. He folded the note quickly and shoved it into his pocket, not wanting anyone to see what had been written. The arrogance he had displayed moments earlier had vanished, replaced by an unsettling feeling he couldn't quite place. What had just happened? And why had a simple note shaken him so deeply? As he signaled for the check, his hand trembled slightly, a sign of the unease brewing inside him. The waiter approached, polite and professional as ever, and placed the bill in front of him without a word. There was no smug smile, no hint that he knew something the millionaire didn't. But the silence between them spoke volumes. The millionaire opened his wallet with stiff fingers, dropping a few bills onto the table, without even counting them. He needed to leave. Now. But just as he stood up, preparing to make a hasty exit, he heard a small voice from the neighboring table. "Mom, can I have dessert?" It was the little boy from the Black family, his eyes wide and hopeful. His mother, still tense from the earlier confrontation, smiled gently at her son, trying to mask her discomfort. She glanced at her husband, and they shared a quiet moment of understanding. They weren't going to let this evening be ruined by a stranger's hateful words. "Of course, sweetheart," she said softly, waving down the waiter. The millionaire, now standing but frozen in place, watched the scene unfold. For some reason, he couldn't tear himself away. Something about the simplicity of that moment, this family, despite everything, finding joy in the little things, struck him in a way he hadn't expected. As the waiter approached the Black family's table, the millionaire caught his eye once again. There was something in the waiter's gaze, a quiet defiance, perhaps that unsettled him even more. He was no longer the most important person in the room, no longer in control of the narrative. He was just a bystander now, watching as the family ordered their dessert, with smiles and laughter, as if nothing had ever happened. But for the millionaire, something had happened. And it wasn't just the note. After what felt like an eternity, he finally forced himself to walk out of the restaurant, the door closing behind him with a soft chime. As he stepped into the cool night air, he felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering discomfort. He fumbled in his pocket for his car keys, the note still tucked away, its words burning in his mind. Meanwhile, back in the restaurant, the mood had started to lift again. The Black family's laughter filled the air, and other diners had returned to their conversations. It was as if the tension had been wiped away, leaving behind only the warmth of a family enjoying a special evening. But the waiter, though calm on the outside, couldn't shake the weight of what had transpired. He had stood up to someone powerful, someone who wasn't used to being challenged. And while the moment had passed, the consequences of that action were still unclear. In the kitchen, the waiter leaned against the counter for a moment, taking a deep breath. He thought back to the words he had written on that note, the words that had clearly struck a nerve with the millionaire. It wasn't often that he got involved in the personal lives of customers. He was there to do a job, after all, but tonight had been different. He couldn't just stand by and watch, as the man insulted that family. Not when he knew how much words could hurt. The restaurant owner, an older man with years of experience, approached the waiter, giving him a knowing look. "Everything all right out there?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. The waiter nodded, though the look in his eyes suggested there was more to the story. "Yeah, just a little situation. But it's handled." The owner gave a small smile, patting the waiter on the shoulder. "You're a good kid. Just be careful. People like him, they don't forget when someone challenges them." The waiter nodded again, understanding the warning but feeling confident in his decision. He had done the right thing. He was sure of it. But as the night drew on and the restaurant began to empty, the weight of what had happened lingered. The Black family, now finishing their dessert, seemed to be in high spirits again, their earlier discomfort all but forgotten. They left the restaurant with smiles, thanking the waiter as they passed. The mother gave him a kind, knowing look, as if she understood more than she was letting on. The waiter smiled back, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. But outside, as the family stepped onto the sidewalk, something caught the father's eye. Parked across the street was a sleek, black car. And inside, behind the tinted windows, was the millionaire, watching them. The father hesitated for a moment, his hand tightening around his wife's, as they stood together with their children. The millionaire's presence was unsettling, but they didn't let it show. Instead, they walked on, their heads held high, leaving the restaurant and the millionaire behind. But something about the way the man had been watching them felt off. And though the night had ended, the sense of unresolved tension still hung in the air. What had the note said? Why had the millionaire reacted the way he did? And why was he still watching them, long after the confrontation was over? The story was far from finished. As the Black family walked down the sidewalk, hand in hand, the atmosphere shifted once again. The father glanced over his shoulder, feeling a strange heaviness in the pit of his stomach. The black car was still there, its engine softly humming. The millionaire's silhouette was barely visible behind the tinted windows, but his presence was undeniable. It was as if he was waiting for something or someone. The father kept his eyes forward, his jaw clenched. He didn't want to worry his wife or the kids, who were still talking about the dessert they'd just had, their laughter cutting through the night air. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the evening wasn't over yet. That man, the way he had been watching them from the car, gave him a deep sense of unease. As they reached the corner of the street, they paused at the crosswalk. The light was red, and the city was alive with the usual sounds of traffic, people chatting, and distant music from bars and restaurants. The father glanced back once more. The car had moved slowly, quietly. It was following them, keeping a distance, but close enough that its presence was hard to ignore. His wife noticed the change in his expression and squeezed his hand. "What's wrong?" she asked softly, her eyes searching his face for answers. He hesitated, not wanting to alarm her or the children, but the uneasiness was growing. "I think that guy from the restaurant is following us," he whispered, his voice low but firm. Her eyes widened slightly, but she stayed calm, looking ahead to where the light was about to change. "Let's just keep walking," she said, her voice steady. "We're almost home." They crossed the street, their pace a little quicker now, though they tried to keep things casual for the kids' sake. The father glanced back again, but this time, the car was gone. It had disappeared into the night, leaving only the faint hum of traffic in its wake. Relief washed over him, but only for a moment. Something still didn't sit right. They had almost reached their apartment building when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a message from a friend, or maybe a work email, but instead there was a notification from an unknown number. He opened it, and his blood ran cold. The message was short, just a few words, but it sent a chill down his spine. "I saw everything. It's not over." His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he felt a wave of anger rise within him. Was this some kind of sick joke? Was the millionaire really this petty? To follow them, and then send a message like this? He looked around, but the street was quiet now. There was no sign of the car, no sign of anyone watching them. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, deciding not to mention it to his wife just yet. There was no need to worry her, not tonight. They made their way into the building, the familiar warmth of the lobby, offering a temporary sense of safety. The kids raced toward the elevator, laughing and giggling as if nothing in the world could touch them. The father smiled at them, but his mind was racing. What did the millionaire mean by "it's not over"? What was he planning? Later that night, after the kids were tucked into bed and the apartment had settled into its usual quiet rhythm, the father sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. The message haunted him. He hadn't responded, but the words lingered like a dark cloud. Was the millionaire just trying to intimidate them? Or was there more to this than he realized? His wife joined him, sitting down across from him with a concerned look on her face. "You've been quiet," she said gently. "Is it about what happened earlier?" He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I got a text. From an unknown number. I think it's him." She frowned, leaning in. What did it say? He pulled out his phone, showing her the message. Her face tightened as she read it, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. He's not going to leave this alone, is he? I don't know, the father said, his voice heavy with frustration. But I'm not going to let him scare us. He doesn't get to decide how our lives go. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. It had started as a simple evening out, a celebration with their family, but now it felt like they were caught in something much bigger. Something dangerous. Meanwhile, across town, the millionaire sat in his car once more, parked in a dimly lit lot. His hand clenched the steering wheel as he thought about the note, the family, and the way everything had unraveled in the restaurant. His mind raced, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He pulled the note out of his pocket, unfolding it for what felt like the 100th time. The words stared back at him, simple but powerful. Respect isn't bought. It's earned. The waiter's handwriting was neat and deliberate, and every time the millionaire read the note, it felt like a slap in the face. He had built his life on power, on wealth, on being the man who had control over every situation. But that note had stripped him of something he couldn't quite define, something that rattled him to his core. And that family, they hadn't even done anything wrong. That was what irked him the most. They had just been there, happy, carefree, and unbothered by his presence, even after his comments. The millionaire wasn't used to being ignored, to being challenged, especially by people he considered beneath him. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. Another unknown number, this time with a single word: soon. He stared at the message, his heart pounding in his chest. Was this some kind of threat? Was someone playing a game with him now? He quickly looked around, but his car was alone in the parking lot. The city buzzed in the distance, but out here, it was quiet. Too quiet. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time in a long time, the millionaire felt vulnerable. Exposed. Whoever was behind these messages, and the note wasn't finished yet. The millionaire sat in his car, his mind racing, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard, his knuckles turned white. The unknown message soon flashed on his phone, taunting him. He had always been in control, always the one who dictated how things went. But tonight, something had shifted. He had pushed, he had insulted, and now it felt like the universe was pushing back in ways he couldn't control. That family. They hadn't fought back. They hadn't even reacted to his insults the way he expected. Instead, they seemed untouched, like they were above his petty words. And that waiter, he had looked straight through him, like he wasn't even afraid. The night stretched on, and the city seemed unusually quiet around him. Every flicker of headlights made him jump, every sound made his heart race. He couldn't sit there any longer. He needed answers, needed to confront this, whatever it was. He glanced at his phone one more time, before shoving it into his pocket. Without thinking, he turned the ignition and sped off toward restaurant. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be that waiter. At the same time, back at the family's apartment, the father lay wide awake, his phone still clutched in his hand. The message "I saw everything." Its not loomed in his mind. He hadn't responded, but the tension gnawed at him. He had faced ignorance before, but never had it felt this personal, this invasive. His wife slept beside him, her breathing steady, but he could tell she was restless too, even in her sleep. He needed to do something, but what? Confronting the man could escalate things, but ignoring it seemed like a bigger risk. Before he could decide, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number: "Meet me. Now. You'll know where." His heart thudded in his chest. He didn't know where this man wanted to meet him, did he? But then, a flash of realization hit him. The restaurant. That's where this had started, and that's where it would end. Quietly, not wanting to wake his wife, he slipped out of bed, grabbed his jacket, and headed for the door. Something told him he needed to face this head-on, not just for his own peace of mind, but for his family. The streets were empty as father walked, the city bathed in soft glow of streetlights. His mind churned with questions, but deep down, a part of him knew that this confrontation had been coming from the moment the millionaire had made his cruel remarks in restaurant. He wasn't a man who sought out conflict, but he couldn't let someone like that believe they could treat him and his family as less than. Not anymore. When he arrived at the restaurant, the doors were locked, the place dimly lit, but there was a figure standing outside, leaning against a lamppost. It was the millionaire. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture seemed different, less arrogant, more uncertain. As the father approached, the tension between them crackled in the air. "You got my message," the millionaire said, his voice quieter than before. There was no hint of the man who had sneered and insulted them earlier in the evening. Instead, there was something else in his eyes: fear. "Regret?" "Yeah, I got it," the father replied, his tone steady but sharp. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" The millionaire shifted uncomfortably, his gaze falling to the ground. "I don't know," he admitted. I thought I was teaching you a lesson, showing you your place. But something changed tonight. That note the waiter gave me. It made me realize that I'm not who I think I am. That maybe all this power, all this money, it doesn't mean what I thought it did." The father stood there listening, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. But something about the millionaire's tone gave him pause. This man, for all his arrogance and cruelty, seemed broken, lost even. "You insulted my family for no reason," the father said quietly. "You tried to make us feel small." "Why?" The millionaire sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he repeated, almost pleading. "Because I could? Because I thought it would make me feel better. But it didn't. That note, it was like a punch in the gut. Respect isn't bought. It's earned." Those words keep repeating in my head, and I can't stop thinking about how wrong I was. For a moment, neither man spoke. The night stretched on, the tension hanging in the air between them, but something had shifted. The father could see that the millionaire was unraveling, struggling to reconcile the man he thought he was with the reality of how his actions affected others. But before the father could respond, a car pulled up silently behind them. The headlights flashed, and the sound of a door opening made both men turn. To their surprise, the waiter from the restaurant stepped out. His expression was calm, but there was a certain gravity to his presence. "I figured you'd both end up here," the waiter said, his voice steady. "There's something you both need to understand." The millionaire looked at him, confusion flickering across his face. "You? What are you doing here?" The waiter met his gaze evenly. "I gave you that note for a reason. You needed to see what you've become. But it's not just about you." He turned to the father. "And it's not just about you either. This whole thing this night, it's a reflection of something bigger. It's about respect, yes, but it's also about understanding. About seeing each other as more than just appearances or assumptions." Both men were silent, the weight of the waiter's words sinking in. "You can't change what happened tonight," the waiter continued, "but you can choose what happens next. You," he said, looking at the millionaire, "you have the power to make things right. And you," he added, turning to the father, "have the power to forgive." The father blinked, taken aback. Forgiveness. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Could he really forgive this man for the things he'd said? For the hurt he'd caused? But as he looked at the millionaire, he saw not a powerful, arrogant man, but someone who was deeply flawed, struggling to find his way. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The millionaire, for his part, seemed to be wrestling with his own demons. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to be better." The father studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll give you a chance," he said, "but don't waste it." In the silence that followed, the tension that had built up throughout the night seemed to dissolve. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Both men knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, they were standing on the same side. As the father turned to leave, the millionaire called out one last time, "Thank you for giving me that chance." The father nodded without turning back. "Just make sure you earn it." And with that, the night came to a quiet close. But as the father walked away, his phone buzzed one last time. He glanced at the screen, expecting another message from the unknown number. Instead, it was a simple notification from his bank, transaction complete. Confused, he opened the app and froze. A large sum of money had been transferred into his account, far more than he had ever seen. No explanation, no message, just the millionaire's way of trying to make things right. But the father only smiled. Respect wasn't bought after all. As the father stared at the bank notification, the realization hit him. The millionaire had transferred the money as a gesture, a way to make amends for what he had done. But money wasn't the answer to everything, not when it came to respect, dignity, and how people should be treated. He knew this transfer was an attempt to fix the damage with wealth, but the words from the waiter's note echoed in his mind. Respect isn't bought. It's earned. This situation wasn't about money, it was about something deeper. He sat down at the kitchen table, his phone still in hand. The quiet apartment felt comforting, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions he'd gone through in the past few hours. His mind raced with thoughts of what had happened, how a simple dinner out with his family had spiraled into something much bigger. The millionaire's insult, the tension, the unexpected intervention from the waiter, and now, this sudden transfer of money. It felt like a whirlwind, but now things were finally starting to settle. He looked at his phone again, contemplating whether to return the money. It was tempting to just let it sit there, to consider it some kind of reparation for the pain and disrespect they had endured. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the right answer. Taking the money wouldn't fix what had happened, and it certainly wouldn't teach the millionaire the lesson he needed to learn. With a sigh, he stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet city streets below. The lights twinkled in the distance, and he could hear the faint hum of traffic. Life was moving on, as it always did, and soon enough, this night would become just another memory. But the impact of what had happened would last far longer than that. His wife's footsteps echoed softly behind him, and she wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his shoulder. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He nodded, leaning into her warmth. "Yeah. I'm just trying to figure out what to do." "About the money?" "Yeah. It's a lot. But it feels wrong to keep it. I don't want him to think that he can just throw money at people to fix everything." She was silent for a moment, thinking. "Maybe it's not about the money," she said softly. "Maybe it's about what you do with it. You could send it back, sure. But maybe there's a way to turn it into something positive." He turned to look at her, her eyes filled with understanding and compassion. She had always been the one who saw things in a broader light, who found meaning, even in the messiest of situations. "What do you mean?" he asked. She smiled gently. "What if you use it to help others? People who've been through what we went through tonight. People who've been disrespected, hurt, or ignored just because of who they are. We could donate it, set something up in the community. Something that reminds people that respect and dignity matter more than anything money can buy." The idea hung in the air, and slowly, the father nodded. It felt right. It wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about turning something negative into something good. Something that could make a real difference. He pulled her closer, grateful for her wisdom, and for the way she always seemed to find the right path. The next morning, he called the bank and arranged for the funds to be transferred to a local non-profit organization that worked to support families facing discrimination and hardship. It wasn't about making a grand gesture or sending a message to the millionaire. It was about doing what felt right, about using that money to create something meaningful. As he hung up the phone, a sense of peace washed over him. The decision was made, and now they could move forward. Weeks passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. The incident at the restaurant gradually faded into the background, becoming one of those stories they would tell friends over dinner, with a laugh and a shake of the head. But the lessons they had learned that night stayed with them, lingering like a quiet reminder of what truly mattered. One afternoon, the father received a letter in the mail. It was from the restaurant, addressed directly to him. He hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure of what to expect. Inside, there was a simple note from the waiter who had intervened that night. "Thank you for standing up for yourself and your family. People like him need to be reminded that money doesn't give them the right to look down on others. You handled it with more grace than most people would have. And for that, I have a lot of respect for you. I hope you and your family are well. If you ever come back to the restaurant, your next meal is on me." The father smiled as he read the note, feeling a sense of closure. The waiter had played a pivotal role that night, reminding both him and the millionaire of what really mattered. It wasn't about power or wealth, it was about respect, human decency, and seeing the humanity in each other. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, his daughter asked a question that made them all pause. "Daddy, why did that man in the restaurant say those mean things? He didn't even know us." Her innocent eyes searched his face, and for a moment, he struggled to find the right words. How could he explain to a child the complexities of prejudice and ignorance? How could he make sense of the cruelty they had faced without making her feel afraid or confused? Sometimes, he began slowly, people say mean things because they don't understand other people. They think that if someone looks different or acts different, they aren't as good. But that's not true. Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are. His daughter nodded thoughtfully, absorbing his words. So he was just wrong? Yes, he said, his voice gentle. He was wrong. And when people are wrong, sometimes they need help to see things differently. That's why it's important to always be kind and stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. She smiled, satisfied with his answer, and returned to her dinner. The father exchanged a look with his wife, and they both knew that while the events of that night had been difficult, they had also brought important lessons they could pass on to their children, and maybe, in some small way, to others as well. As the days turned into weeks, the donation they had made in the community began to take root. Programs were established to provide support and resources to families who had faced discrimination, offering them a space where they could feel seen, heard, and valued. The father and his family quietly participated in the work, volunteering their time and offering support in whatever way they could. It felt good to be part of something that was making a difference, something that would outlast the sting of that one unpleasant night. And as for the millionaire, word eventually reached the family that he had left the city not long after the incident. Some said he had taken time away to reflect on his life, while others believed he had moved on to new ventures in a different place. Whatever the truth, they never saw or heard from him again. The father sometimes wondered if he had learned anything from that night, but he knew that wasn't really what mattered. What mattered was how they had responded, how they had taken something hurtful and turned it into something good. In the end, it wasn't the insults or the money that defined the outcome. It was the choices they made, the way they chose to rise above the negativity and focus on what was truly important. Respect, dignity, and kindness. These were the things that lasted, the things that mattered. And as the father looked around the dinner table at his happy, healthy family, he knew that they had come out of the experience stronger, more connected, and more determined to live their lives with purpose. The story of that night became a part of their family's history, a reminder of the challenges they had faced and the values they held dear. But it was also a story of hope that even in the face of ignorance and prejudice, people could choose to be better, to do better, and to make the world a kinder, more respectful place for everyone.